The property sector in the Chinese economy has always been something of a puzzle. At its peak, it accounted for a quarter of the nation's economic output, broadly measured. And it sees people in Beijing and Shanghai paying house prices similar to those in San Francisco and New York, despite having just a quarter the income of American buyers. Now many believe that we are about to see a violent contraction of the property market in China. The government wants to intervene to curb speculation and rein in what it calls the three high problem: high prices, high debt, and high financialization. The approach has been nothing short of dramatic. Financing for property developers has tanked. Earlier this year, property sales declined by as much as 20 to 30%. In progress developments are not being completed and people have taken to the streets, banding together to stop mortgage payments on such projects in protest. One of the main sectors that was driving China's GDP is the real estate market. It accounts for 13% of the country's GDP and makes a third of its economic output that includes houses, rental and brokering services, industries producing white goods that go into apartments and construction materials. The only problem is that China has built way too many homes than it needs, to the point where it has turned the sector into a bubble. Many of China's largest property developers are failing to repay their debts. Even the survivors are cash-strapped and in a liquidity crisis. The risk is that the property market crisis will drag the broader economy down with it, hitting suppliers, small and medium-sized companies in construction, well as household consumption. And dangerously, the banking system has at least a quarter of its assets in property. China has at least 65 million empty homes, which is equivalent to the entire population of France and half the population of the world's largest country. But why has China constructed 65 million empty homes? How did China end up creating the largest housing bubble in history, and how is it finally about to collapse, bringing down the entire global economy with it? All of these questions and more will be answered, but first, give this video a thumbs up and let's get started. When it comes to investing in the United States, you have real estate, the stock market, and government bonds, where you can start investing with as little as a few dollars and earn some interest over time. You are not concerned that the government will intervene in the kidnapping of a CEO on a beautiful morning simply because he said something critical of the president or the ruling party. The stock market has been stable for over a century, with the S&P 500 growing at an average rate of 10%. U.S. government bonds are also considered stable. The United States credit is built on centuries of stability and responsibility. However, not all countries are like that, particularly China, where the government controls almost everything. There is the good fortune of transparency and freedom. CEOs who oppose the ruling party may vanish overnight, and their companies may be destroyed. Nothing will save you from the ruling party's wrath. Even if you are the richest person in the country, the average Chinese person is aware of this. As a result, few people are willing to take the risk of investing in the stock market or government bonds. That is why everyone in China is interested in real estate. You can't just save money at the end of the day. You must invest, particularly in China. People save far more than in the United States or almost anywhere else on the planet. In China, real estate is your best bet. On top of that, China is isolated from the rest of the world. An average Chinese doesn't really have access to the US stock market, and getting money out of the country is not an easy job. So we can confidently say that real estate is your only option. So let's go back for a moment to the graph. We watched the beginning of the video. This unprecedented GDP growth was primarily driven by real estate, which has now deflated. That's about to burst. That's how properties in Shenzhen and Shanghai became more expensive than in Los Angeles, despite the fact that GDP per capita in China is $10,000, while it's more than $60,000 in the US. If these 65 million homes are listed on the market tomorrow, the market will undoubtedly crash, but not the economy, because China is simply too large, with a population nearly 5 times that of the United States. However, this is only a small part of the issue. When a developer wants to build an apartment building in China, he must first obtain permission from the local government. The developers start selling apartments before they are even built using that cash. The developer starts building the rest and in the process selling the apartments. At the end of the day, it often takes years to complete such a project, but because the economy is booming and hundreds of millions of people are buying homes, the developers in China can't wait for the project to be completed, so they use the cash from previous projects to start building new apartment blocks in hopes of selling them in the process, and while they are building the new project, they use the funds from it to start the third project and so on, and if there aren't enough funds to start new projects, the developers can simply take loans to continue building. Banks are more than happy to provide the loans since they will be backed by real apartments that are in high demand and rising in price every year. There is no way they will ever go bankrupt, since, if they can't afford to pay back the loan, they can simply sell the apartments to do that. The developers kept taking huge loans to continue building and people kept taking mortgages to continue buying homes. Does it remind you of something, 2008? This strategy works only when everything is growing. When the economy is booming, people make money and continue buying homes. But what happens if the economy stagnates? What happens when people are forced to stay at home due to a virus and no longer have enough money to buy new houses? The answer is straightforward: Evergrande. It's strange how people always assume that things will continue to grow indefinitely. To put it mildly, humanity is pitiful. In any case, the unthinkable occurred. A virus spread around the world, and the Chinese government implemented a zero-COVID policy, forcing the entire population to be vaccinated and stay at home for long enough to eradicate the virus. So the Chinese developers began to crumble since people stopped buying homes, the money stopped coming in, so the developers couldn't finish hundreds of apartment projects they had started back before the pandemic. The first major developer that began defaulting on its debt was Evergrande. It's the second largest property developer in China and 122nd largest company in the world, with over $300 billion in debt. Its only hope was a government bailout. People stopped making their mortgage payments since the construction of their homes has been delayed, causing an even bigger crisis. More than $220 billion worth of loans could be tied to unfinished projects. The Chinese government provided $148 billion in loans to property developers. Mortgage holders may be granted a payment holiday without having their credit score affected. The government was perfectly aware that a bubble was forming, but it was perfectly fine with it because it was driving those annual GDP numbers, and now it is attempting to burst that bubble in a way that will not crash the economy. Whether it will be able to do so or not, only time will tell. However, there is a much bigger issue: people have lost faith in the real estate market. People regarded the stock market and government bonds as untrustworthy assets. They will now view real estate as an unreliable and speculative asset as well, which means no more 7 or 8% GDP growth. From now onwards, that doesn't mean people will stop buying real estate, but it would be much slower than it was before the pandemic. If the bubble burst, as it did in 2008 in the USA, the crash could be much worse, and secondly, if it happens now, inflation globally will only get worse since, first of all, we are not yet out of the pandemic, and Russia's invasion is causing a global energy crisis. The world economy is barely surviving. Europe can't even fix its energy crisis, the US can't lower the rates and is suffering from high inflation and a potential housing crisis as well. So the implications of the Chinese housing crash could end up taking the global economy for another few years of recession, if not a depression. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.